Okay, let's start with something pretty provocative. What if the name Jesus just wasn't in the original scriptures?
Yeah, and what if, everything you thought you knew about salvation, the Messiah, even your own spiritual identity,
Yeah.
what if it was deliberately rewritten?
Exactly. What if God actually had a different name and the Messiah a completely different face, a different origin story than the one we usually hear?
It's a challenging set of questions.
Welcome to the deep dive. So, for this exploration, we've gathered a collection of sources, quite a stack actually, covering some really unconventional, maybe even startling perspectives on biblical history and identity.
hmm And these sources, they really go deep, don't they? They're making claims about ancient names being erased, forgotten origins, histories that have been deliberately hidden.
Right, and a view of identity and the resurrection that turns a lot of common understanding on its head.
It definitely pushes against centuries of established thought.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to unpack these specific sources. We want to pull out the key insights, the core arguments they're making, and help you navigate these pretty complex, sometimes conflicting claims.
Yeah, help make sense of what they're actually putting forward.
Okay, let's get right into it. One of the very first, and honestly one of the most impactful claims these sources make is about the power locked inside names, specifically the name Yahweh.
Yes. The core claim is stark. The sacred name Yahweh was intentionally, systematically removed from Scripture.
And replaced with titles, right, like God or Lord, which sound respectful, but the sources argue they're generic, they lack the original power.
Exactly. And they don't just see Yahweh as a name, they describe it as the sacred name.
Yeah.
Sometimes represented, by those 4 Hebrew letters, Yod, He, Vav, He.
Yod, He, Vav, He, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes pronounced Yod, Vav.
Yeah, or Yahweh. They frame it as the very breath of existence, almost like a specific frequency, a vibration.
Not just a label you put on someone.
No, much more fundamental. Like a cosmic signature, intrinsically linked to a deep, resonant power. It's how they present it.
And they throw out a number that's pretty staggering. According to these sources, this name, Yahweh, appeared over 16,800 times in the original Hebrew texts.
16,800 times.
Yeah.
And yet, you pick up many common Bibles today.
And it's gone. Or maybe in a footnote somewhere, if you're lucky.
Right. The claim is that speaking this name, or even just knowing it with real understanding, was meant to align you with immense spiritual power. It was connection.
So why remove it if it's so important? The sources argue it wasn't about reverence, which is often the explanation given.
No, they say it was purely political. That's the controversial bit. The argument goes, when Rome wanted to consolidate control over faith systems, they knew they had to conquer the language, control the divine narrative.
Right, because an empire, like Rome, according to these sources, couldn't really afford to have its subjects directly accessing a god whose name itself unlocked personal identity, power, real intimacy.
Exactly. People connected at that level with that kind of divine awareness. They're just harder to control, aren't they?
Much harder. So the claim is Rome essentially renamed him. They tamed him.
And made sure the masses gradually forgot the original name, and crucially, the power that came with it. The sources sometimes point to Psalm 83.8, that men may know that thou whose name alone is Yahweh art the Most High.
Emphasizing that word alone.
Yes, presenting it as unique and essential.
Okay, this flows right into another huge claim they make, the distinction between Yeshua and Jesus.
A really key distinction in these sources. They present Yeshua as the authentic Hebrew name, rooted in that divine identity, vibrating with ancestral power.
And the name itself means something specific, right?
Yeshua means Yahweh is salvation. It directly links the Messiah back to the very name, Yahweh, that they claim was erased. It's intertwined.
And they contrast Yeshua sharply with the name Jesus. How do they describe that?
They describe Jesus as basically a Greco-Roman construction, a name made palatable for the masses living under Roman rule.
Palatable and manageable.
Manageable for the state, yeah. That's the implication. They point specifically to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
Right, Nicaea, a major turning point.
A pivotal moment, according to these sources. They claim Emperor Constantine, the Roman emperor himself, was right there, sitting at the head of the table.
Using his imperial authority to
essentially guide the process, to vote, as the sources put it, on sacred doctrine, on defining who the Messiah was, even on which books made it into the official scriptures.
Wow. So they see it as a deliberate effort to, rebrand the Son of Yahweh?
That's exactly the language they use, a rebranding. And what came out of that process, they argue, wasn't pure original faith,
It's something else.
something they provocatively call a franchise.
A franchise. That's a strong word.
It is. They argue the Roman system took this revolutionary figure, this prophet of fire, who challenged earthly power structures, and turned him into a more sanitized religious icon, a kind of poster boy for the empire, making his message less disruptive, more controllable.
Which leads to their argument about the loss of power. If you change the name, you change the connection.
That's the core of it. Changing the name, they argue, diluted the divine power associated with the Messiah. It disconnected him from his source, from Yahweh.
So speaking the original name's Yahweh, Yeshua with understanding.
Causes a tangible shift, they claim. Like the veil between worlds thins, spiritual chains break. It's not just saying words, it's reconnection. A powerful act.
They even make this really startling claim that in deliverance situations, when dealing with spiritual darkness, the name Yeshua makes entities tremble.
But the name Jesus,
Sometimes they say they just laugh.
it's a stark contrast they draw.
Yeah.
The argument is that the name Jesus, having been filtered through the empire, fits Caesar's tongue, serves the earthly system.
But doesn't carry the same heavenly authority.
Exactly. Lacks the raw power of the original. They literally call it spiritual sabotage.
Which fundamentally challenges how many people view and use the name Jesus today, suggesting its prevalence might be the result of a historical strategy.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What is the name you call on, the name you feel connected to? What does it truly mean for your own sense of connection, your spiritual power?
Yeah. The sources really push you to look beyond just the sound. Consider the root, the history, the claimed authority tied to that name.
Okay, so from names, the sources then shift gears, going even deeper into the past, unpacking ancient origins.
Right, asking why there seem to be so many different names for God in the early texts. Are they just synonyms, or is something more complex, maybe even surprising, going on?
They start by introducing El, a figure they say was worshipped separately, long before Yahweh became the main focus for Israel.
This is an older tradition.
Much older, yeah, rooted in the wider Canaanite world. El is depicted as this wise, patriarchal figure, the eternal creator, often seen as the father of the other gods and of humankind.
And they mention finding evidence for this in ancient texts.
Yes, particularly the Ugarit texts discovered in Syria. These portray El enthroned, presiding over a kind of celestial council.
And isn't the name Israel itself sometimes interpreted in relation to El?
That's right. One interpretation is one who struggles with El, or El, which is the short form, suggesting a really deep, perhaps even contentious historical relationship.
Okay, so that's El. How do they then describe Yahweh's early identity?
Well, they contrast it sharply. Yahweh, in the earliest layers they examine, isn't initially presented as the singular creator of everything.
More like,
Potentially one of the sons of El, or perhaps a powerful storm god, a warrior figure connected to the southern deserts, places like Edom, Midian, Sinai.
so less of a universal creator initially, more of a regional force.
That's the picture they paint. Roaring through the desert, tempest, lightning, a formidable, fiery deity before becoming the sole god of Israel.
So how did these two figures, El and Yahweh, seemingly merge into one?
The sources don't see it as a simple replacement, not Yahweh just taking over. They describe it as more of a divine convergence, a complex theological evolution playing out over centuries.
Forged through history, myth, maybe conflict.
Absolutely. They argue that over generations, Yahweh's prominence grew, and he began to absorb El's characteristics, his titles like El Elyon, El Shaddai, Elohim.
Almost like a strategic merger, consolidating divine authority.
That's a good way to put it. A strategic merger. They see this transformation as driven by cultural collision, shifting power dynamics.
And probably the need for a unifying vision, a single, powerful God, as Israel was forming its national identity.
Precisely. Monotheism, in this view, wasn't born in quiet contemplation. It was forged in the storm of these converging traditions and identities.
Okay, now this is where it gets even more, let's say, controversial based on the sources. They bring in archaeological evidence.
Yes, from places like Kuntalet Ajrud and Khirbet el-Qom, inscriptions found there.
And these inscriptions suggest...
They suggest that Yahweh, much like the older Canaanite deity El, was sometimes associated with a divine consort, a goddess named Asherah.
Wow. Yahweh and his Asherah, is that the phrase sometimes found?
That's the kind of phrasing found in some inscriptions, yes. And the sources argue that figurines, amulets, references to sacred trees or poles found in ancient ruins. They further hint at Asherah having a place in early Israelite worship right alongside Yahweh.
So they interpret this as maybe a cultural memory, a time when divine masculinity and femininity were seen as complementary.
Exactly. A worldview that reflected the divine realm in both male and female aspects. A concept they argue was later suppressed as monotheism became more strictly defined.
So how did that suppression happen? They talk about the prophets, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea.
They frame the prophets as revolutionaries, essentially, actively fighting against the worship of competing gods, Bel, Asherah, even lingering reverence for El in his older, separate form.
Not just teaching religion, but fighting a culture war.
Absolutely. A battle for the spiritual identity, the soul of Israel. And the turning point, according to these sources, was catastrophe.
The fall of the kingdom, the exile to Babylon.
Yes. The prophets didn't see this as Yahweh failing. They reframed it powerfully as Yahweh's judgment on Israel because of their unfaithfulness, because they turned to rival gods.
Ah, so it was during the suffering of exile.
That this stricter, more exclusive form of monotheism really took root, forged through reinterpretation, purified by hardship, you could say.
And the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
The sources present that not just as a creed, but as a revolutionary manifesto, a declaration tearing down the old pantheon, asserting Yahweh's absolute sole claim.
It's a much more dynamic, even messy picture of how monotheism developed than is often presented.
It really is. And it makes you think, how does understanding that struggle, that evolution, change how you view faith today? Does it make it feel more human, maybe? More contested?
Definitely challenges assumptions about a simple linear revelation. Okay, let's keep digging. The sources make another powerful claim. This issue of idolatry, it wasn't something Israel just stumbled into. It predates them.
Yeah, they argue a spiritual war was raging long before the Ten Commandments. Not just earthly conflict, but a cosmic rebellion, a kind of shattering of divine harmony that infected humanity.
And they pull from texts like the Book of Enoch.
Right, which isn't in the standard Bible, but is referenced in these sources. It talks about these celestial beings, the Watchers, descending and teaching forbidden knowledge.
Forbidden knowledge like?
Enchantments, dark arts, sorcery, even blood magic, weapon crafting, and crucially for this point, carving idols.
So idolatry is presented not just as making a statue, but as a form of spiritual sabotage.
Exactly. Like a virus infecting humanity's spiritual DNA, designed to rewrite their connection to the true divine, fought with lies and deception.
And they use the story of Abraham to illustrate this, from the book of Jasher, another reference text.
Yes, it paints Abraham as born into a world totally saturated with false gods. His own father, Terah,
Was an idol maker and seller.
according to Jasher, yes, an architect of idols. And the story goes that young Abram starts questioning these lifeless statues.
And then he famously smashes them.
Right. And the sources frame that act not just as youthful rebellion, but as his first real altar, built not in worship, but in wreckage, an act of rebellion against the falsehoods surrounding him.
Suggesting he had to fight his way to faith, not just inherit it.
Precisely. He wasn't given faith on a platter. He had to battle through layers of deception.
So Israel then didn't invent idolatry. They were born into a world where it was the norm.
Absolutely. They spent 400 years, according to the narrative, immersed in Egypt. Think about it. Gods of the Nile, the sun god Ra, Pharaoh himself considered divine.
It was steeped in their cultural memory.
Deeply. So Yahweh's deliverance wasn't just about physical freedom. It was a direct confrontation with centuries of spiritual contamination.
And the sources argue that without a serious spiritual detox,
Freedom from Egypt could just mean swapping one form of bondage for another, slipping back into those familiar patterns.
which brings us straight to the golden calf incident, Exodus 32.
A classic example viewed through this lens. The people get restless. Moses is up the mountain.
And they want a God they can see, touch, maybe control, make us gods.
Who shall go before us? And the calf they fashion, the sources point out, looks a lot like Apis, the Egyptian bull deity.
A spiritual relapse, a return to the gods of Egypt they'd supposedly left behind.
Exactly. But here's the nuance. The sources stress.
Yeah.
They didn't say, we reject Yahweh.
No, they said, make us gods, plural. Or, this is your God who brought you out, referring to the calf.
Right. It was about adding another god, making the divine more convenient, more visible, mixing the holy with the profane.
And the sources emphasize Yahweh's nature here.
As a god who simply does not share worship, he demands exclusivity.
So when Moses comes down and smashes the tablets,
It's not just about breaking rules. In this view, it symbolizes a broken relationship. They traded this intimate, demanding covenant for a convenient, controllable statue.
okay, so beyond Egypt, what about the Promised Land itself? Canaan.
The sources detailed the specific deities Israel encountered there and worryingly often started worshiping. It's quite a list.
Like
Baal, the powerful storm god. Associated in some texts with really dark practices, child sacrifice, ritual sex.
and Asherah, again.
Asherah, yeah.
Yeah.
Often called the queen of heaven. Seen as a direct challenge, sometimes with her altars built right next to Yahweh's.
Moloch.
Moloch, the fire god. Infamous for demanding infant sacrifice, often linked to seeking wealth or success.
Dagon.
The Philistine fish god, famously humbled when the Ark of the Covenant was placed in his temple.
Any others?
Tammuz, linked to pagan mysticism, a dying rising god cycle. Rimmon, Chemosh, Resheph, Shamash, the sun god. Even a figure they identify as the Canaanite El, a false father of Baal, distinct from the original El figure.
The land itself needed purification in this view.
Desperately. Turning to these gods wasn't just making a mistake, it was profound spiritual betrayal. The prophet Hosea famously calls it adultery.
And the appeal of these gods.
Idolatry, the sources argue, often offered shortcuts, tangible results, seemingly on demand through ritual or manipulation.
Whereas Yahweh required.
Covenant faithfulness, trust, responding to genuine faith, often in his own time and way, not just reacting to ritual demands.
So how does this ancient history connect to today? The sources draw a direct line.
They really do. They argue that stone and wood idols might be gone, but the underlying spiritual forces, the patterns of deception, they're still active.
Just dressed differently.
Exactly. Bowing down to Mammon, the god of wealth, or vanity, maybe fame, image, rebranded as self-fulfillment, lust, presented as just sexual freedom.
Power at any cost, like male reborn.
That's the connection they make. Different names, maybe different rituals, but the same ancient deceptions, the same temptations, pulling people away from exclusive devotion.
So why does this ancient struggle matter to you, listening now?
The sources pose the question directly. Are your own altars, the places you give ultimate value, are they cluttered? Are you maybe still flirting with modern forms of Baal, seeking shortcuts, control, validation, outside of that genuine exclusive connection?
Because they claim Yahweh has always called out a remnant. A core group willing to choose him alone, even when the culture is pulling in 1,000 other directions.
It's a call to self-examination, really.
Okay, the sources don't just challenge the history of worship, they challenge the very image of God, pulling from archaeology, history, painting a different picture of Yahweh.
Yeah, they argue quite strongly for Yahweh's origins being rooted not in Canaan initially, but in the volcanic deserts of the south. Midian, Edom, Sinai.
Places known for fire and intensity. They mention the Ugarit texts again.
Right, noting that those northern Canaanite texts don't seem to mention Yahweh. His origins, they suggest, lie in the furnaces of the southern wilderness.
A god of fire, smoke, trembling mountains, like the description of Sinai.
Exactly. Exodus describes Sinai with smoke, fire, shaking trumpets. The prophet Deborah even sings about mountains melting before Yahweh. It's powerful, fiery imagery.
And they connect this to forged gods.
Yes, suggesting Yahweh fits within a category of ancient deities associated with metalworking, transformation, and fire. Figures like Hephaestus in Greece, Ptah in Egypt, Vulcan in Rome, gods of the forge.
Which links Yahweh to craftsmanship, transformation.
Directly. They point out Moses encountered God in Midian, a land known for copper mines and metalworkers, like the Kenites. There's even Tubal-Cain in Genesis, a forger of metal instruments.
So Yahweh is seen as the ultimate transformer, taking raw material.
Like rough ore, or
Yeah.
maybe like flawed humanity,
Yeah.
and refining it through fire into something useful, something sacred, turning stone into a sanctuary, ordinary people into prophets.
And the building of Solomon's temple, all
Yeah.
that bronze and gold.
They see that detailed metallurgy, the huge bronze altar, the golden lampstands, the massive molten sea basin as a kind of theological statement in metal, a tribute to this divine craftsman God who works with intense heat and pressure.
Even Zechariah mentions divine smiths.
Right. Yahweh is the master smith, the shaper, working with holy fire, tempering life in the heat of trials. It's a very different image.
Now, here's a really unexpected connection the sources bring up. Plutarch, the Greek historian.
Yeah, this one often raises eyebrows. Plutarch claimed, centuries later, that the Jews of his time seemed to honor a form of Dionysus in their rituals. He specifically mentioned Yausabal.
Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. How do the sources connect that?
They explore potential links Plutarch might have been observing or maybe misinterpreting. Things like the golden grape clusters and vines decorating the temple, descriptions of cherubim that some interpreters felt resembled satyrs.
The prophet Amos talking about mountains dripping with wine as a blessing.
Right. And even later, Roman coins from Judea that sometimes depict figures with ivy, occasionally label Bacchus Judas, linking Bacchus, the Roman Dionysus, with Judea.
So the sources are asking, what if Yahweh's identity was even broader, encompassing joy, ecstasy, the life in the vine, aspects that got maybe hidden?
That's the question they pose. How much of a potentially more multifaceted, left purely severe divine identity might have been suppressed as the religion became more rigidly defined over time? Was something lost?
They also revisit sacrifice through this lens. Moloch and the child sacrifice warnings.
And they connect that to depictions of the Canaanite El, sometimes identified with Kronos, who, in some myths, sacrifices his own son.
Leading to a really challenging suggestion about Abraham and Isaac.
Yes, they propose that the story of Abraham being commanded to sacrifice Isaac might be a later, profoundly sanitized retelling, a divine drama that evolved from a memory of rituals that were once actually practiced in the region before being forbidden and repackaged as a test of faith where the sacrifices stopped.
Suggesting the Bible repackaged a difficult past.
That's the controversial interpretation offered in these sources.
And then there's the influence of Greek philosophy.
Huge influence, they argue, especially through the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures made in Alexandria, Egypt.
How did that change things?
Well, they argue that as Jewish scribes translated and interpreted their faith for a Greek-speaking, philosophically minded audience, they inevitably started refining the image of Yahweh through the lens of Greek concepts, particularly Platonic ideas.
Making Yahweh more like a Platonic demiurge.
Something like that, yeah. More universal, immaterial, perfect, transcendent, which resonated with Greek philosophy, but the sources argue it stripped away some of the earlier, raw, earthy, fiery aspects.
And maybe suppressed feminine aspects too, like Asherah.
That's part of their argument, yes.
Yeah.
That the philosophical refinement led to a more abstract, less embodied, perhaps more exclusively masculine portrayal.
They even connect Plato himself to mystery cults.
Right. Noting Plato was likely an initiate of Greek mysteries, Eleusinian, Dionysian, Orphic, which involved secret rituals, initiations, symbols.
And they see echoes of these in
Levitical practices, ritual sprinklings, specific priestly garments, sacred feasts, the whole idea of initiation through suffering. They suggest parallels.
Raising the bold question, were some practices later called pagan actually ancient pre-Canaanite spiritual truths or rituals that early Israelites participated in before things got cleaned up?
It's a provocative question about the roots and evolution of ritual practice. Were things borrowed, adapted, or suppressed?
So, faced with all this potentially unsettling information, how do the sources frame it? Not as tearing down faith, but
as reclamation. That's the key term they use. Reclaiming a truer, fuller, maybe wilder picture of Yahweh.
not the tame, whitewashed figure that...
Fire, a voice from the whirlwind, hands at the forge. Maybe even, they suggest, a black craftsman, God, a God of smoke, power, liberation.
And they use that powerful analogy, the same fire from Sinai following descendants across the diaspora.
Yes, from Sinai to Mississippi, as they put it. Connecting the ancient struggle to modern experiences of oppression and liberation. To truly know this God, they argue, you have to remember not just who he became through theology and history,
But who he was in those earliest, most dynamic forms.
they urge you, the listener, to question what you've been taught, to look for what they call the black fingerprints, the hidden clues in Scripture, to awaken from colonial theology.
To reclaim Yahweh as a God of fire, justice, maybe even rooted in Africa.
It's a call for a radical remembering.
Okay, let's shift to the final major area, the Messiah and the resurrection. The sources start by observing something many people feel, that the resurrection story, while central, can feel kind of hollow in modern religion.
Yeah, like the immense power isn't fully grasped or experienced. They ask, is there a hidden history here? A revolutionary view of resurrection tied to identity and justice that's been obscured.
And they immediately circle back to the erased name, Yahweh.
Emphasizing again,
Yeah.
over 6,800 times removed, replaced by Lord. They call this a spiritual assassination.
Killing off not just a name, but power, covenant, intimacy.
Exactly. Severing that ancestral root, the Hebraic identity. And by doing that, they claim it fundamentally rewrote the Messiah's identity and consequently erased your potential place, your power within that story. They bring up Psalm 83.18 again here too.
Then they tackle the Messiah's appearance head-on, challenging the common European depictions.
Emphatically, they state he was not European, not soft, born in colonized land, directly confronted Rome, and they point straight to Scripture, Revelation 1.15.
Feet like unto burnished bronze, hair like wool.
Descriptions they interpret, along with historical context, as indicating a black Hebrew man, radical, dangerous to the empire.
And because that image didn't fit the empire's needs?
He was systematically remade, whitewashed. And they argue this wasn't just racism, though, it was that too, a spiritual colonization. Stripping his ethnicity, erasing the black and brown lineage in the story.
And they stress his true name again, Yeshua.
Meaning, Yahweh is salvation. Contrasting it sharply with Jesus, which they maintain is a mistranslation, a Roman remix.
Changed, they argue, to control the narrative, twist the mission.
From liberation and challenging empire to something more like passive submission. But they claim that mask, that imposed image, is cracking now.
The real Yeshua, as they put it, fiery, truth-speaking, black, is rising in people's awareness.
Then they offer this really unconventional take on the silent years, ages 12 to 30.
Yeah, what do they suggest happened then?
They argue silence didn't mean inactivity. It meant initiation, intense preparation. They propose he traveled maybe to Egyptian temples to learn about vibration, resonance.
There's sages in India for sound, breath, alignment, Eastern mountains for revelation.
That's the kind of journey they envision. Returning not just as a rabbi, but as a frequency carrier, a vessel of divine technology.
Which reframes the miracles.
Completely. Not as supernatural violations of physics, but as demonstrations of advanced spiritual science. Walking on water through mastering resonance, healing blindness via energy transference, raising the dead through, get this, DNA reactivation.
DNA reactivation.
Wow.
And the kingdom of heaven within.
Becomes not just theology, but a biological truth, an inherent blueprint within us all. They even provocatively claim the church hides DNA relics because his genetic code was celestial.
That's big hua, but the core point they draw is
that his mission wasn't just for people to worship him. It was to awaken that same potential, that same blueprint, the capacity for spiritual science within you.
You are the blueprint, basically, meant to live and act with that same power.
That's the radical implication. To do the greater things he spoke of.
Okay, then the crucifixion, how do they frame that?
Not solely as a religious sacrifice, though they acknowledge that layer. Fundamentally, they stress it was a state-sponsored execution by Rome.
Why? Because he was a threat.
A direct threat to the empire. Preaching the kingdom of Yahweh, a radical alternative reign, where Caesar ultimately had no authority. Two kingdoms couldn't coexist.
So Rome made an example of him, public execution.
Hung publicly as a stark warning. Don't challenge the empire.
And then the resurrection. They claim that was hijacked too.
Hijacked, yeah. Stripped of its original Hebrew power and context, they focus on Passover.
Yeshua died as the Passover lamb on Passover.
Right, but they claim that connection was deliberately erased and replaced with Easter.
Which they link to. Pagan roots, Ishtar.
Exactly. The Babylonian goddess Ishtar. They point to symbols like bunnies, eggs, sunrise services as evidence of pagan Roman and Babylonian rituals, supplanting the original Hebrew meaning and timing.
So what should have been this ultimate act of divine rebellion?
Got domesticated. Turned into a state-sanctioned holiday, disconnected from its revolutionary roots, ultimately serving the empire's interest by neutralizing its power.
But the true resurrection, in their view,
was anything but domestic. It was cosmic revolt, a divine uprising, shattering death, breaking empire's grip, unleashing kingdom fire.
The tomb wasn't a quiet garden, it was a battlefield.
A battlefield, and Yeshua rose from it not as some placid figure, but as the roaring lion of Judah. Again, they emphasize the description. Dark skin, voice like thunder.
Rising not to start a religion, they argue,
but to reignite a covenant, the ancient covenant with Abraham, the prophets, Israel, reclaiming everything the empire and compromised religion tried to erase.
And a key part of that mission, they claim, was gathering the lost sheep of Israel.
Specifically, the scattered ones, the hidden ones, whose identity got buried by history, oppression.
And they explicitly connect this to
the African diaspora, arguing many descendants are among these lost sheep, stolen, stripped of names and history, but not forgotten by Yahweh.
So the resurrection becomes vindication, reclamation.
Vindication of this man, Yeshua, and reclamation of a people carrying covenant in their bones, prophecy in their blood. Their time to rise has come, they proclaim.
Yeshua rose to awaken those who carry his image, his fire, across the globe.
It connects the resurrection directly to restoring identity and purpose, especially for those whose history was stolen.
Okay, to make it crystal clear, the sources lay out what they call 7 lies about the resurrection and Messiah's identity. Let's run through them.
Lie number 1, his name was Jesus.
Counter, his name was Yeshua, Yahweh is salvation. Jesus is the Roman remix, a mistranslation severing connection.
Lie 2. Died Friday, rose Sunday.
Counter, Yeshua said 3 days and 3 nights, like Jonah. Friday to Sunday doesn't fit. Story bent for Roman tradition.
Lie 3. Passover was replaced with Easter.
Counter, he died as the Passover lamb. Rome replaced it with Easter, rooted in the pagan Ishtar festival.
Lie 4. Salvation is by grace alone.
Counter, Yeshua said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Grace is the door, obedience is the path. It's not just passive acceptance.
Lie 5. He was white.
Counter, Revelation 1.15, skin like burnt bronze, hair like wool, a black man. Erasing this was spiritual colonization.
Lie 6. He had no ethnicity that mattered.
Counter, his Hebrew identity was deliberately stripped, erasing black-brown lineage, disconnecting African descendants from their inheritance.
And lie 7. The resurrection was a passive event.
Counter, he conquered death, dismantled empire's claim, rose as the roaring lion of Judah, a holy uprising.
These aren't just presented as mistakes, but as strategic deceptions, designed to keep people spiritually blind, broken, bound.
So why hide all this? What's the motive, according to the sources?
Simple. Truth births freedom. And real freedom inherently threatens systems built on control and chains.
Especially, they argue, when people, particularly black people, discovered the Messiah's true identity, his revolutionary struggle.
Everything changes. Whitewashed religion crumbles, the colonized gospel shatters, people reclaim the fire, the power they were meant to have.
So a resurrected Yeshua, understood this way, means identity restored, covenant reawakened, spiritual power returned to those the empire tried to erase.
It's potent stuff.
Yeah.
And what does it mean for you listening? The sources state, the same spirit that raised Yeshua from the dead lives in you.
Not just abstract theology, revelation made flesh, liberation, not just religion.
They claim Yeshua is calling you by name, like he called Lazarus. Come forth.
Come forth from what?
From dead religion.
Job.
False names, Roman lies, spiritual slavery, the silence imposed by colonized history. Come forth into prophetic awakening. This, they say, is your resurrection moment.
The Lion of Judah has risen and is roaring inside you.
Calling scattered souls, anyone who resonates, rise with me. Their final, really provocative thought is, you weren't just saved from something to go somewhere else later. You were born to become resurrection, right here, right now.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground. We've taken a deep dive into sources that, let's be honest, fundamentally challenge conventional religious understanding.
We really have. Claims about the political power of names, Yahweh, Yeshua, the complex, maybe even contested origins of ancient faith.
Yeah.
El, Yahweh, Asherah.
The pervasive nature of idolatry, ancient and modern. A very different view of Yahweh's identity, fire, forge, transformation.
And finally, this hidden revolutionary history of the Messiah and the resurrection, tied so deeply to identity, ethnicity, and liberation.
These sources definitely invite us, maybe even force us, to question, to dig deeper, to wrestle with history, identity, spiritual power.
Absolutely. They remind us that faith, as presented in these texts, was often forged in struggle, in conflict, in evolution. And sometimes uncovering that complexity, even if it's uncomfortable, can lead to a deeper, maybe more challenging kind of awe.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over based on everything we've unpacked from these sources. If the kind of power they describe is really tied to reclaiming true names and true identities, not just for God or the Messiah, but for people themselves, what could that mean for your own spiritual journey, your sense of self?
What would it genuinely mean for you to rise with Yeshua in your own life, reclaiming whatever feels like it had been lost, suppressed, or hidden within you?
If this deep dive stirred something in your spirit, maybe raised more questions than answers.
Don't let it end here.
Yeah.
The sources suggest this is just the beginning of exploring a potentially very different, maybe much deeper understanding.